Two, one. All right, guys, welcome back to the Alvin Pure Fitness Podcast. Today, I have Mircea back on to talk about everyone's favorite anabolic steroid, Trenbolone. So, I uh, I have some thoughts about this steroid. I think that in general, it's the most well known besides testosterone, just because of like bro lore. And I think back in the early steroid days, I think like people were like it's kind of like the test and trend was like pretty popular from what I understand. And as people like Mircea with Team Evil Genius, and Brock really, I believe, being the progenitor of the sort of quote unquote safe for use model. Um, you shifted more towards DHTs and less of like the trend just because of like health effects. But yeah, I guess just before we dive into like those specifics, let's go into like the background of trend and like what actually the history of it is and like why it actually came to be, as well as like what makes it so unique from other steroids.
Well, basically, Trenbolone is a 19-node derivative, so it is derived from nandrolone, is that part of the family tree, that branch, if you will. First discovered in 1963. The first actual marketed Trenbolone was Trenbolone acetate. It's been very popular in the veterinary market because it is so wildly potent. Milligram per milligram, it yielded more retention of mass when, shipping cattle cross country. And when I say cross country, I'm talking about the US, where there's actually a fucking country, not Europe. So it's actually a big place, and cattle lost a lot of size. Insert Trenbolone or the Phenaplex, Phenaject pellets, and for a very small dose of Trenbolone, you retain a lot of the mass. Also used to beef up cattle before sending into the slaughterhouse. Interesting thing, Trenbolone was so acidic, caustic, I believe, that the urine of the cattle was actually degrading the quality of the soil. Like
Right.
the soil became completely useless after a herd of cattle just all over it, for lack of better terms. It actually led to some, I'm not sure if mutation is the right word, but some birth defects in species like small rodents and toads and snakes and stuff like that. They were growing in the Tren infested plains. So it definitely, that was one of the causes why it was replaced in livestock or banned in most places.
Mm,
Um, Trenbolone has been used as a human compound. The Trenhex hexahydrocarbon benzoate. I hope I got that wrong. It's a really long, complex name, but Trenhex is basically the deca of Trenbolone. It is a long ester, long lasting Trenbolone. It was the French parabolan, came in 76.5, some wacky number,
right.
uh, milligram per 1.5 ml ampules. So it was a very wacky number, and it was a 1.5 ml ampule, long lasting Trenbolone, very popular. Came to the market in 1980, was discontinued in 1997, um, for unknown reasons. Literally, there has been no reason why it was discontinued, but it was very, very popular. A lot of bodybuilders swear to this day that there is no Trenbolone on the market now, or they have never used a Tren Hex from a even from a pharmaceutical company that was as potent as the original French parabolan. And of course, we have Trenbolone and enanthate, which is purely a UGL product. That was never neither a human and neither a veterinary product. So that's about the history of Trenbolone. Why it is so potent? It has a few chemical modifications, especially a double bond at the C9 and C11 junctions, which uh make it increases its binding affinity, and also it has a very potent binding constant. What that means is binding affinity. It very easily binds to the receptor, and I just said receptor because typically androgen receptor, yes, but because of its structure, it's kind of like a skeleton key. It can bind to other receptors as well, which is one of the reasons, and I'll get into this, for its potency. The other thing is, the binding constant is it sticks to that receptor. It latches on, it sinks its claws in, and it doesn't leave. An ideal steroid, at least in my opinion, would have a high binding affinity and a low binding constant. So it clicks into the receptor, it sends the signal, it clicks out, it clicks into the next one, sends the signal, and so on. Trenbolone just latches on, sends the signal, and stays there until it dies. Um, the affinity to multiple receptors is probably one of the reasons why it causes some of the secondary effects, progestinic effects, some of even the psychological effects. It does have some metabolic effects. It is a very interesting drug, highly potent, um, doesn't aromatize. Paperwork shows that it does not convert to DHT, so it's immune to the 5-alpha reductase enzyme as well as the uh, aromatase enzyme. Problem is, it does activate the progestin receptor, and that makes even smaller amounts of estrogen be more potent, or it lowers your tolerance for higher levels of estrogen or estrogenic side effects. And the progestinic, or sorry, not progestinic, prolactin. The prolactin side effects are very, very similar to estrogenic side effects. So possibly one of the differences that prolactin, lactin, lactation, basically if you squeeze your nipples and you will lactate. Yes, that is where the word comes from. So
Very
yes, you
nice.
can get that from Tren. Yeah. Not do not recommend. Doesn't look very nice. But yeah, those are some kind of typical reasons why Trenbolone is it's a very potent androgen. It's a very potent anabolic. I believe Bill Llewellyn has it as a 500 to 500 anabolic to androgenic ratio. Not a perfect ratio, but if we take it compared to testosterone, it is 5 times as anabolic, but also 5 times as androgenic. So basically 5 times as potent. Doesn't really pan out in real life, but I would definitely say that a Trenbolone is, in my opinion and experience, twice as potent as your basic testosterone.
Yeah, I think that first off, I mean, it's so interesting, like hearing about how like the smallest changes in chemistry can make the most big, massive changes as far as how the compound behaves. Um, I think that just like in my personal experience, what I've seen with most people taking trend and like applications of it is powerlifters who are insane because like they I think some people really like those psychological effects, and I think for strength it can actually have some really good effects because it kind of like Marshawn Lynch, one of the running backs for the Seattle Seahawks, he said that one of his things, like, I want to, how you feeling, Marshawn? I want to punch the motherfuckers in the mouth. That's like how he felt. Bro was probably taking some Halo or something like that. But like Trent also has that feeling. I think that can also be like one of the those desirable effects for strength. Um and then also there probably are some unique effects for neurology too, if I'm, not mistaken. And then I think that is most commonly used in a pre-contest setting for bodybuilding because there's unique effects on like how you might look. Um, like personally, like myself, I had one time I took Tren for 5 days and I couldn't like I could sleep, but like it felt like I didn't sleep at all. And I actually got like weaker on it because I wasn't able to like recover. And I frankly didn't feel like I looked that much different now. Granted, it was only 5 days and I was on acetate ester, but like I didn't like look that much different like on mass and test and DHB. Um, like, is it kind of like one of those things that people just take it because they take it, and like the unique effects on the glucocorticoid receptor in that pre-contest scenario? Is there like, if you want to like be a pro like in bodybuilding, you want to have that look, you must take Tren.
Basically, is trends sometimes, most of the times, a lot of times overhyped? And my opinion is yes. It is a very potent anabolic. It is a very strong androgen. It does work. Yes, it does have some impacts on glucocorticoid receptors and might lower cortisol levels, but I think that those impacts are not that significant. Like they're not the be all end all. It is, because it is a very potent androgen, it does have that kind of hardening, kind of grainy look, gives that grainy looking effect to the body. So yes, it does work well in a contest, a pre condescending, but it also upregulates TSH production. And when you're trying to fill out with carbs, that's probably when you don't want your thyroid to be hyperactive. That's why a lot of bodybuilders have problems carbing up if they're still using T3 or T4 or combination thereof. Possibly Trenbolone can interfere with that as well. There's a reason why some people say like, oh, I just eat pizza and take Tren and I get leaner and bigger. Like, yeah, if your thyroid is upregulated. Maybe that's also one of the reasons why some people get the night sweats, which is very specific to Trenbolone, and not many people report that from other anabolics, but definitely from Trenbolone. The night sweats, the lack of sleep, heightened aggression, which is a very psychological effect. Increased strength, that is an interesting one because it is a potent androgen, so that might be the cause of neurological effects, but it's very different than something like a DHP or a masteron. They're actually derived from DHT, or testosterone converts to DHT. At least on paper, and to the best of my knowledge, Trenbolone doesn't. Trenbolone is just the raw Trenbolone is very androgenic in and of itself. Um, Same thing or the opposite thing with DECA. DECA actually 5-alpha reduces to dihydronandrolone, which is a very weak androgen. So basically, the raw DECA is more androgenic than the DHN. So if you take something like finasteride, a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor with DECA, you actually get more androgenic negatives because it doesn't convert to DHN. So you have more of the actual DECA, which is slightly more androgenic than DHN.
Mm.
Possibly that's the reason why people get ED from DECA, but that's a different drug. That's a different story. Trenbolone, um, and here's a very interesting thing. People talking about sexual function and libido. People say like Tren makes you very horny. I don't find that to be the case. I think Tren unlocks certain, let's say, sexual proclivities, but it doesn't increase your libido. It just makes you more loose with what you actually want to say, do, or whatever. It's if you're into some weird kinky shit, you'd be much more comfortable admitting that you're into whatever weird kinky shit. It seems less weird and less kinky to you. Let's call it that. Uh,
Right.
that Timbaland does weird things, and with the aggression, I I think that's a bit overplayed as well. I think people are just looking for reasons to justify being dickheads. I've known people that have taken well over 500 mgs of Trenbolone, and they were literally the calmest, nicest people on earth. And I also know people that legitimately they took one shot of Trenbolone acetate, 50 milligrams, and they just became like they just became a different person. So the effects are there, but I don't think that such a big number of the population actually gets those effects from Trenbolone. I think they're just looking for an excuse to act like assholes.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a general thing with most anabolics. I don't think that it's really a big issue. I think it's kind of just like if you're naturally kind of a dickhead, you're going to be more of a dickhead on anabolics, and it also kind of gives you that out. Um, as far as like strength and whatnot, and then you mentioning that how it behaves it did differently. What did you mean by that as opposed to like DHTs?
Well, the structure of because of its structure, it does not, or at least should not, and I have no reason to believe it really does. At least all the studies that I've seen or read point out to it not being susceptible to the 5-alpha reductase enzyme. If I'm wrong, somebody please correct me. But it does not convert to a version of a dihydro version. There's no dihydrotrenbolone. There's dihydroboldenone, for example, which is DHB. There's dihydrotestosterone. There's dihydronandrolone, but trenbolone does not. And the DHT derivatives like Masteron, Primabol, and Anavar, Winstrol, they are derived from that very androgenic DHT. So the neurological effects of trenbolone, you can obtain possibly the same results, but through from a different kind of drug, a different kind of mechanism. It is androgenic again in and of itself. Now, how much does the actual androgenic effect play a role in this versus the actual spike in aggression? Now, that's an interesting question. You may just become so aggressive that it kind of takes the foot off any sort of brake that you have. Like you normally wouldn't punch a wall, but if you get angry and aggressive enough, you might just do that. I believe that that's one of the magical benefits of Tren. It makes it kind of disinhibits you, and you are more aggressive, more angry, and that's what makes you want to punch people in the face, or makes you want to deadlift 800 pounds rather than something like DHB where you can walk up happy and smiling to an 800-pound loaded bar and deadlift it with a smile on your face, because it doesn't make you more aggressive, but that definitely increases your strength.
Yeah. I also think like with this too, like I think that you mentioned that individual like response with the psychology, and I think that's just such a huge factor here because like like what you said, like I think that all these drugs, like you hear some people say, oh, this makes me anxious or whatever. It's just like I think it's so different for every single person. And I also think that I think it's largely overstated, and in my opinion, it's like you're either taking too much of that specific drug for what you can tolerate at that time, um, or like you're kind of looking for that, in my opinion, because it's just like you tell someone, "Hey, you're taking testosterone," and they're not actually taking testosterone, like they're gonna, "Oh, I'm going to grow better and get stronger." I think that's are largely the like I'm not saying trying to doesn't work very well. Like it obviously does, but I think that's largely the effect a lot of bodybuilders have, and a lot of um, powerlifters have that might choose to take it. Is like, cool, I'm taking this, and I'm going to be taking my training more seriously, my diet more seriously, my sleep more seriously, etc. Um, but one thing I did want to ask though is because so we talked about DHB in another episode, and that's a hyperpotent compound. From what you said, about three times, basically about three times as potent from an anabolism and five times as potent from neurology compared to say 100 milligrams of masteron. Um, as far as Tren, how would you rate that as far as, muscle growth versus strength? Because I think one of the things that happens, especially as you get into higher tier bodybuilding, if you have to inject like 3 grams of steroids to like grow, which is what a lot of people have to do at that level, you have to inject like even if you're taking masteron and tests and say you're doing 1,000 tests and 2,000 masteron, we're talking like what 15 mils of fluid, and using a more hyperpotent compound can sort of help that out. So what would you say there in regards to potency?
Um, I'll touch on the bodybuilding and then uh different dosages, etc., in a second. But to answer your question, I do think it's twice as potent as building muscle, probably twice as potent at increasing strength, maybe a bit more. Again, it's hard to discern what is the actual strength and what is the aggression that you get from it. Um, Things like anadrol, you just feel slow and fat and heavy, but you're really strong. That is actually improving your strength. And the only method I can find is the neurological pathway, because it doesn't make you more aggressive. It actually makes you kind of makes you feel heavy, if that's a
Hmm.
thing. Trenbolone does have more of a psychoactive effect. It does make you feel more aggressive. Again, depends on the individual, but it does increase that. Maybe you're just a very tame person and you can actually bottle it in and use it when you need to. But I think, yeah, strength wise, maybe twice as potent for anabolism and strength, maybe a slightly bit more for strength, depending on how much aggression plays a role in your sport or in the strength work that you do. Um, and to touch on bodybuilding, I think that is a thing for that's why it's so, so you ask, is it something you need to take as a bodybuilder to become a pro or an Olympia level bodybuilder? Um, I don't think you need to, but I think when you get to that level, and I have seen and heard of bodybuilders using way more than the 3 grams you mentioned. I'm talking a few times more than that. So when you get to using 6, 7, 8, 10 grams of gear a week, that's a lot of injection volume. So you need to look at drugs that can be in a very high concentration, like testosterone, that can easily be made test 300, test 400. I've seen test 500, but I would not recommend that to anybody. Things like boldenone, which also can be up to, testosterone, boldenone, and nandrolone deca. I've seen all those products in 500 milligrams per ml concentrations. I would not recommend them, but maybe at 350 to 400, yeah, that should be a very painless injection. So you're looking at either drugs that have a very low melting point and can be suspended at a very high concentration per ml, or drugs that are hyper potent. And this is where things like Trenbolone, like DHB, like Ment come into play. The drugs that per unit milligram are so potent that they do give you 2, 3, 4, 5 times the anabolism or whatever trait you're looking for that you will get from a testosterone, a boldenone, deca. Um, yes. So do you need it? Can you replicate the Ren look without Tren? Yes, of course. You can use some testosterone, you can use some DHTs, you can use some oral for the fullness, you can use some halotestin for that dry grainy look. There's a million ways to skin a cat. But is Trenbolone like a very plug and play kind of like I just pin it and that's it when you don't have to get fancy with pharmacology? Yes, but it's also a bit more brute force, not so elegant. And I think the secondary effects, the negative effects, are slightly worse than if you would actually try to go a more elegant way and try to get that look for show day and not look, shredded 365 days a year.
Right. Um, yeah, I think that you made some really good points there. Um, I guess like though so like basically like just twice though, like only like twice as strong as like test milligram per milligram.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, it's overrated
Again,
as
it
fuck.
was yeah, but I mean, at promoting muscle growth, yes, but it also the things that you'd get from Trenbolone that you maybe won't get from something like DHB is the fullness. It is
Yeah,
still a 19 nor derivative, so you do get that full round effect. It is something that is unique. Now, actual protein expression, yeah, it's definitely, in my opinion and experience, more potent than testosterone, but it isn't like this holy grail that yes, it's 10x as potent as testosterone or whatever. No, no, I don't think it is that. It is that mythical. I honestly, and a lot of people will shit on me for saying this, but I think that what people want from Trenbolone, except for the aggression, they get from DHB. They're actually looking at DHB and should not be looking at Trenbolone.
right. Um, yeah, it's just I think it's just overhyped because you see all these guys are like, oh my God, I got so strong with this. And like I don't think that a lot of people really understand. Like a lot of this comes down to like there are some drugs that have really unique effects, but I think a lot of it comes down to like milligrams, just total taken. And I think that determines a large proportion of the anabolism and potentially strength gain. Um, this is a little bit off topic, but one of the things I've noticed, Mircea, is powerlifters, like you look at naturals versus enhanced, and obviously there's a debate of are they actually natural, but for the justice getting we don't know, but let's just say that they are. Why do anabolic users seem to not be like as strong at a population level as the naturals are? Because you would think that with these drugs, you would see more of these outliers with strength. Like you do see some really strong guys like John Hack and Colton Engelbrecht and Brianni Terry, and they are stronger than any natural will probably ever be. Um, but that's not normal. Um, is there like a method of like maybe like this or that, this kind of, I guess it's just to sort of back to trend, like maybe some long-term neurotoxicity that might maybe potentially lower down force expression long term, or is this maybe something else,
Uh,
or
well, the neurotoxicity of Trenbolone, there have been some studies that there is some sort of plaque buildup on the brain, specifically from, and I'm not even sure if it was Trenbolone or 19 Nors in general. Dave Crossan talks a lot about getting those kinds of effects, and I believe he attributes those to DECA, to actual nandrolone deconate, not Trenbolone. But I don't think it's as big of a deal as people make it out to be. But anything that is a psychostimulant or has any effect on your psychology, definitely you should consider that it might have, if you take it in high enough doses for long enough, it might have some long-lasting permanent effects on brain chemistry. If it affects it temporarily, it might lead to, you know, some sort of long-lasting. I'm not sure if it's even damage but I would say changes. That would be the right word.
Mhm.
Now, to answer your question, and this might be in reference to I don't know, who was it that said that gear only makes powerlifters 10% stronger than naturals or
Mike is Patel.
whatever. Yeah. But no, he got it from somebody. It was another guy from that evidence-based community. But regardless, I think that whoever said it is smart because and this is actually a conversation I had with Broderick, so I'm crediting Broderick for this. Now, this is not necessarily, I mean, I agree with it and I can work that out myself, but he said it first. Um, the guy is very smart, probably because he managed to use statistics to make a very valid argument. What he didn't mention, I'm sure he's not dumb enough to not realize this, but um, those people that are 200 pounds natural versus the person who's 200 pounds on a gram of gear, those people are 200-pound natural because that's their genetic makeup. That they would probably be, if they didn't train, they would probably be 190. The guy that needs a gram of gear to be 200 pounds would have probably been 160 pounds natural. So compare the 200-pound natural to the 160-pound natural and then see the difference in strength. That person used that gear to get the 200 pounds, and he's probably 10x stronger than he was at 160. You see what I mean? So that guy has 10, 40 extra pounds of artificial muscle that he built with gear. And he is, yes, 10% stronger than the guy who was structurally, genetically created to be 200 pounds natural. Now give the same thing to a 200-pound natural guy and he becomes 240 pounds. Now put him in a weight category with the guy that is 240-pound natural, if there are many of those. And you'll see that, oh yeah, the 240-pound guy is only 10% stronger on gear than the 240-pound natural. Yeah, but without gear, that guy would have been 200 pounds, not 240. You see what I'm
Mm,
getting?
yeah.
Without the gear, if you take two guys that are the same body weight, but one takes gear and one doesn't, the guy taking gear used all that gear to get to that body weight. Otherwise, he would have been probably, I don't know, 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds lighter. The guy who was just 200 pounds natural, he was just, born that way. Like there's people like Hafthor Bjornsson or Brian Shaw who, would have probably been 300 and something pounds just sitting on the couch and eating pizza. Of course, somebody who needs 3, 4, 5 grams of gear to get to 300 pounds is probably not going to be vastly more impressive than a natural 300-pound Hafthor Bjornsson.
Mm. So like even with when we talk about all these effects on neurology, it's not as big as people think. We're talking like that 5 to 10%,
And
range.
again, that's a study that's on average. That's comparing some statistics. I'm not even sure that that's super accurate. I think that,
I think it's so much different with like strength because like I've found that
yeah.
for myself personally and the clients I've coached, with you're just building muscle and body, like it's nuclear warfare. Take as much as you can without killing yourself, and you're going to grow more. With strength, it's not that. It's not the case because like the high doses, it causes like more stress and like more of that sympathetic nervous system like upregulation, and then it's like you reach like this very, I guess it's a very not a very drawn out like a very like it's very like diminishing returns like very fast for
Hmm.
strength. And I think that's why like we kind of look a little bit more at like orals or at hyperpotent compounds to have like maybe a little bit more of that effect on neurology, because for strength it's like we don't need that much to facilitate like slightly greater force expression. Um, Higher doses tend to impair recovery from my experience too. Um, there's just more overall stress. Um, and then like that's just what I've observed. And then look, John Axe, a great example of this. He said that he's never taken Tren, and he's only taken testosterone, anadrol, and anavar. And it's like
Oh, yeah, John Hackson an anomaly.
for
Like he's
sure,
so far off of the spectrum that he's a different
for
species at this
sure,
point.
for sure. And he's also a world champion before even hopping on. So that's another thing.
Yeah.
But I guess like my point with that is like I've seen it's just if your goal is muscle growth, then yes, you should need to like escalate the milligrams and have them up and up and up. But for strength, I just found like, man, I've seen like I had some bright spurts of progress like coming off cycle, like because I just like lowering down all that stress. It's not long term, but it's like my body's like less stressed out from it's like driving around the Ferrari all the time as opposed to the Honda Civic.
Hmm.
You say that that's like an
And
accurate take?
yeah, I mean, well, again, there were a lot of athletes that stopped taking anabolics, 1 to 2 weeks before their competition because they needed to let that drug stress subside so they could actually perform better. But again, I think that yes, you're right in a sense, but it's also comparing what you could achieve naturally versus not. Like, for example, I carry around what 60 to 70 pounds of artificial muscle. I was a scrawny fucking runt. My one rep max on a bench press was 225. Now I can incline bench that for 20 reps on a bad day. But if I haven't would not have taken gear, I would have never been 65, 70 pounds heavier than I was natural. So of course somebody who's, my body weight right now naturally, of course they can probably do the same thing or maybe do 15 reps with a 200, with 225, but they're natural. And they had that 225 just because they had better genetics or whatever. So, that's what I'm trying to say. You would have never gotten to X body weight or X body weight at X leanness, at X muscle mass without the anabolics. Sometimes
Mhm.
it's also things that you don't think about, like bone density. You, if you have very fragile bones, you can get a stress fracture from a bench press or a squat. Take anabolics might increase your bone mineral density so you don't get that bone fracture. You see, there's so many things at play that are going on in the background. If you just want to look at numbers and be a statistician, cool. But if you actually think of all the underlying processes going on, there's so much hiding in the details.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because that's also just I've been something I point out to a lot of these natural guys. I'm like, well, I don't think you see a difference like 200 pounds below because for most people it's just like that's how jacked naturals can get. Like they're without getting really fat. Red then as you go above that, then you start seeing the delta be a lot larger as far as what these bigger guys are putting up is a larger proportion of their body weight can be muscle mass. And then you make a great point about how like if someone could naturally get to like, you know, 200 pounds, um, and they hop on anabolics, like of course they're going to be stronger because their ability to build more muscle is higher. That they can just be more jacked. And I think that's if you look at all these top level powerlifters, like they're all really big. They look different than bodybuilders do, but that's because they don't train this the same way. But they're all incredibly jacked, and like I don't think like there's a very big difference between like a powerlifter back versus a bodybuilder back. And like I would say like they're both impressive for different reasons. Like that's a good example of it. Um, but like I think that as far as like drugs go, and I guess like just relating this all back to Tren, I guess like why do I really want anything to be like, if you use Tren, then fine. Just I don't want this to be like the drug that's like it's the game changer. You take Tren and it's going to just, be the difference between you being, 150 pounds and 200 pounds. Like, and a lot of times you hear these stories about Tren and you're like, bro, you took Tren when you were 2 years into training. You could have gained that other 20 pounds that you did in that 1 year by just eating and sleeping more and having a better training program and hiring a fucking coach. Like, probably wasn't the trend. And the thing about those people too, to hop on early, it's like, it's almost like they're less like, number one, they need way more later on, but they're like less like responsive to like training stimulus and whatnot, because like, I don't know, like sometimes with those people, it's like I've had some clients who have like had that happen to them, and I'm just like, it kind of like stripped down their training entirely. Also, they get way stronger, like way faster than they should. Um, and I do think it has to do with that. And are there any effects of trend on like your connective tissue strength? Does it actually weaken it?
That is a phenomenal question, because a lot of people ask about that, and honestly, I haven't seen anything that would point in that direction. I think it's just you're getting very strong, very fast, and couple that with heightened aggression, and it's a recipe for you doing more shit than you should and getting injured. But actual physiological damage to connective tissue, no. Now it does act as an anti-inflammatory. That could be a good or a bad thing because of its effect on glucocorticoids. It can be a good or a bad thing. You reduce some of that inflammation that can actually expose your joints. Inflammation is not always bad, but I honestly don't think that it has deleterious or beneficial effects on joints. So it's not like that that it has very good effects on joints, or it's not going to dry out your joints or whatever.
Hmm. Yeah, I wanted to definitely to get that out because I've heard it's like it weakens them. Um, I guess one other thing to touch on is, are there any differences between acetate and enanthate as far as reaction to the actual compound, other than like ester? And this is something that you'll hear very commonly between people, is that, oh, they behave differently when, like, I always like, well, it's both trend. It's just ester length, but I have heard and seen people say that like, they look different on like enanthate versus acetate.
Well, this is one of the things that I kind of changed my opinion on just through sheer experience. And it's more not a 180, but more of an observation. I have on paper, it is the same drug. It's, Trenbolone, whether it's acetate, enanthate, or Trenhex, it's still Trenbolone, peanut butter and jelly. But I find that the faster acting esters, to some people, give a slightly different or slightly more pronounced secondary effect profile than the slower acting esters. I've noticed on average that, at least with the people that I've worked with, the faster acting esters are the ones that cause a bunch of these unwanted side effects, like the night sweats, like the anxiety, like the elevated heart rate. All of these kind of typical trend-like symptoms. I find that a lot of people get them from the fast-acting esters. Now, I've also seen people that have reported the exact opposite. They say, "I love Tren acetate; it works well for me. Every time I take an antate, I can't sleep. I have night sweats. I'm hyperactive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." So, they definitely do behave. I find a lot of the psychological effects are more the differences are more in the psychological effects, but I've also seen some of the physiological ones because night sweats are a physiological effect, definitely. So yes, they do behave slightly differently in the quote side effect profile, but as in which one builds more muscle, dose equated, half-life equated, I don't see a difference. It's just, if one makes you sweat like a pig all night and you can't sleep, then you're kind of missing out on recovery. If one doesn't do that, then yeah, you're getting all the benefits because you're sleeping well, you're eating well, you're recovering, et cetera, et cetera. But also to mention something that you very well said, I don't think Tren is a beginner drug. Not that there are beginner and advanced drugs, but I think Trenbolone is one of those drugs where there's so much you can gain from lower risk, lower potency compounds, that some people might never need Trenbolone. Some people might respond well to it. Some people might need it, but a lot of people don't, and a lot of people shouldn't even consider it until they have worked their way up the ladder using different compounds that may or may not have better effects. And again, there's people like Dave Crosland who isn't wrong, but his school of thought is maybe less milligrams of more potent compounds versus more milligrams of less potent compounds. That's kind of like the yin and yang, Broderick, Team Evil GSP, and Dave Crosland and his philosophy. Crosland would be more of a less milligrams, more potent compounds. We here at Team Evil GSP would be more of the idea of less harmful compounds, more milligrams. In
Mm.
again, on average, case dependent, but yeah, that those are and actually Broderick and Dave did have on a member site, there is a conversation between the two of them on this exact topic.
Yeah, like the only way that you're really going to like know is by experimenting, right? Like, some people they can't take Anavar without like getting the worst like blood work I've ever seen. And then the same person who can
Yeah,
take 100 milligrams of Tren, they're like, your kidneys look a little bit weird, but nothing crazy. Um, and the whole conversation about different doses, I really do think it's just like you just have to experiment with like each compound and start low and slow, and like what you guys always preach at Team Eagle Genius, like longer, lower, slower. I think a little bit more
correct.
long term because that's so important with all this. And you don't want to you don't want to use the wrong tool for the wrong job. And if you're just a beginner, there's no point in taking a ton of anabolics because it's like you're only going to grow so much in so much time anyways. All you're trying to do with the anabolics is kind of just, in my mind, it's just like grow like an intermediate. Like you could gain like
Hmm.
a solid 1 to 2 pounds of muscle like per month while you're on, and then you kind of like wash out later on in the process. I guess you mentioned the typical side effects of Tren and that one of the mitigation strategies is taking different esters. Um, I know that most of the time I've seen kidneys take a really big beating on Tren. There's also some, blood lipid, issues as well. But like, what would you say, like, if someone was to take this, what are some things they should do to potentially minimize the negative health ramifications? This could include duration of exposure and stuff like that.
Well, duration of exposure, that's the first one. So bravo. That was actually probably the biggest hitter. But maybe second only to don't take Tren. So
Hmm.
it's kind of like if you're gonna take it, don't take it for too long. Or too high doses. The prolactin issues usually appear in a lot of people. So I wouldn't go straight to a dopamine research receptor agonist like what's the name? Cabergoline or pramipexole. I would not go to those. I would probably start with the B vitamin P5P. Probably that in a 100 to 300 milligram dose. Kind of takes the edge off all of the prolactin negatives of Trenbolone. Keep saying progesterone. I don't know why. I'm sorry. Then the other thing is, well, it doesn't convert to estrogen. So if you're getting estrogenic secondary effects, it's not from Trenbolone or it's just the prolactin ones. Doesn't convert to DHT. So if you're getting, you know, kind of like wild androgenic negatives, like your hair is falling out, something, again, it's not 5-alpha reducing to DHT. So things like tamoxifen, Arimidex, finasteride don't seem to do much to mitigate those, anything from Trenbolone. The nephrotoxicity Um, I don't know. I haven't seen Trenbolone cause kidney damage in the absence of other markers. So, for example, yes, if you have elevated red blood cell count, yes, if you have elevated blood pressure, yes, if you're taking other drugs that might have a very potent renal metabolism, yes, I can see that. But then in that situation, can you actually blame the Trenbolone, or is it just the other compounds that you're using? Now, or actually the symptoms that you're experiencing, the high blood pressure, the red blood cell count, etc. Now, when people say like, "Oh, I've seen messed up blood work when it comes to lipids and so on," yes, that I have seen that with Trenbolone as well. But when it comes to kidneys, most people just look at creatinine levels, and creatinine levels in uh, hard training individuals and enhanced individuals is not a great marker to actually assess kidney health. I would go with something like a cystatin C test if you actually want to see kidney health and blood work, or you can get a kidney MRI or a kidney ultrasound to actually see the actual structure of the kidney if you're actually concerned about your kidney health. But just blatantly saying that I've seen bad kidney health from Trenbolone, no. No, I have seen bad kidney markers from elevated blood pressure for a long period of time, high water retention, high RBC count. And usually those people that have those secondary effects also take Trenbolone. So, it's kind of like, is it just a certain type of individual that is prone to taking higher doses, not monitoring their health, not checking their blood work? Are they more prone to taking Trenbolone and then they're blaming it on the Trenbolone, or is Trenbolone actually doing something to degrade kidney health? I would say it's more the former than the latter.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot of it is individual. Would you say that like if someone's like EGFR was like good, would you like not go looking around for like a cystatin C, or would you just like include that regardless?
Um, Typically, let's say cystatin C is one of those markers that I wouldn't check with every set of blood work if I didn't have a reason to. If EGFR is fine, I would maybe do cystatin C once a year. Um, unless you're very health conscious and have the extra money to spare, because cystatin C is a pretty expensive test. Uh, if you have the money to spare, they don't take more blood out of you, so why not test it? But honestly, if EGFR is good, I would probably check cystatin C only maybe once a year or every other set of blood work.
Mhm.
Or
I
if there's a
guess.
specific reason to check it. Yes.
Mhm. That makes sense. And then I guess let's just the just to end things off here. How would you minimize the negative mental effects of Tren? And then what would be like typical doses and duration of exposure?
That- That's a good question. The mental effects of trembolone, I don't know. I honestly I can't say that because haven't seen I haven't seen people that experience those effects and found anything to mitigate them. I think it's just one of those things that if you actually get such horrible, uncontrollable mental, psychological side effects from Trenbolone, maybe you should stay off of Trenbolone or use it only when you need it. It's kind of like, if you can't help yourself, then, just stay away from that drug. Sadly, there's
Hmm.
no, or at least I don't know an answer to this question. Um, Typical doses and duration, good God, that's a good question. Acetates maybe 4 to 6 to 8 weeks at most. I would probably, if it's a fast acting ester, possibly before a powerlifting meet, possibly at the front or back end of a contest prep in bodybuilding, or before a competition in where you need heightened aggression, like maybe some sort of combat sport. if you're looking at an enanthate that, again, or hex, that takes 5 weeks to build up in your system. So yes, then you're looking at if you take it for just 8 weeks, barely reach peak levels. So possibly looking at something maybe longer duration, 12 weeks or more, depending on who you are and how you respond to it. Maybe even 16 weeks. If you respond, I know somebody who actually has better blood work when he takes Trenbolone than when he doesn't. It's the
Wow.
weirdest fucking thing. Yeah, that's the weirdest fucking thing. But yeah, dosages, again, it's a very potent compound. If you start with an acetate, probably 3 times a week, the lowest you can go, 20 milligrams, 30 milligrams, work your way up. If you're working with an enanthate, maybe even as low as 100 to 200 milligrams, for your basic, beginner user. Advanced users probably go way above that. I've seen people
Hmm.
take a gram of Tren, and I don't necessarily
I
condone it,
think
but I have seen it.
I think the starting dose is the most important thing to get here
Yeah.
because yeah.
20 to 30 milligrams 3 times a week with an acetate, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or every other day, and probably like 100 milligrams and work your way up to 200 for an enanthate. If you're a beginner Trenbolone user, probably something like that. Same thing for Hex as for enanthate. Um, I typically, again, this is just my observation and experience. I typically find that a lot of people start experiencing some of the negatives over that 200 milligram threshold. Usually under that, at that or under, they don't get as many of the negatives if they're prone to them. Once they pass 200, I see that more. They're getting the negatives more often than not.
Mhm. Well, cool. Unfortunately, I have to wrap things up here as I have a call to get to. But Mircea, thank you so much for coming on. I'm going to include all of your details in the show notes as usual. And I thank you guys for listening to the episode. I'll talk to you guys in the next one.